The most successful scientists can tell a great story.
Science is messy and complicated and hard and human.
Trying to bring some empathy into these scientific discussions.
There are all sorts of psychological effects of narrative.
There's a story going on there. In fact, there's usually a whole set of stories.
I think storytelling is hugely underrated, but massively important part of science.
How are we going to tell a story with this data?
Hang on, this wasn't the scientific fairy tale I was told.
Hello, and welcome back to the Storyology podcast, where I, material scientist and storyteller Dr. Anna Podajski, take a deep dive into the intersection between science and storytelling. In this podcast, we're tracking the presence of story down the pipeline of how science gets done, from funding to publishing to public dissemination in the media. Right now, we're examining the start of the process, the role of story in deciding what science gets the funding for it to happen in the first place. So far, we've heard how the most successful researchers are able to sell themselves and their ideas through storytelling, using hooks, characterization, a clear example of change, and repetitious narrative that reinforces the key messages. But last episode showed us that there are lots of problems with this system, including the massively competitive nature of scientific funding that sees researchers perhaps overemphasize the role of the individual and pursue less risky short-term goals. This episode, we'll hear from our experts about some potential solutions to these problems, and also why any of us should care about these problems in the first place. First, let's start by hearing Andrew answer my question: what would you change about the current funding system?
Many things. And I spend my life trying to change it in little local ways. I think one almost everyone is agreed on is trying to get a little bit better on thinking long-term versus short-term. There's lots of things that pull you towards the immediate, but actually sometimes setting those long-term goals is very, very important. I think that's quite a widely shared view that would be important. I think there's also this worry that too much time is spent in stuff that doesn't lead to productive outcomes. I talked about the 5 to 10% of proposals that usually succeed. There's something quite unhealthy about, and we've become perhaps over-fixated on being too much about competition and not enough about cooperation in how we achieve selection of excellence. And again, there's various things going on to explore that and develop good evidence on what actually are the most effective ways of making those decisions. So very strongly supportive of that. I also just think it's this question, I sort of talked a little bit about it, the tension between what was said at the proposal stage and what actually happens. And I want, as far as possible, I want to free the creative inventor to apply their wonderful problem-solving skills. And so making both the proposal and then the grant that follows it flexible in ways that empower rather than constrain is definitely something I want to change. And that sounds simple, but it's so easy to accidentally introduce for a very well-intentioned bit of bureaucracy, something that 5 years down the line you find has led to a project being significantly less successful than it might have been. And so I'm now sort of 25 years into a career in research funding, and it's sort of all this accumulation of senses of where good intentions led to undesirable outcomes. A lot of what I'm now trying to do is just allow someone or a group with a vision and a good idea a reasonable amount of freedom to achieve what they want to do, whilst then connecting them to the various constraints that they need to think about in terms of responsible outcomes. And so that's sort of the direction I'd like to see the system change, but it's not a straightforward thing at all.
Freeing the creative inventor sounds like a wonderful idea if we can get there. I suppose at the proposal stage, that would be allowing grant stories to maybe have more open-ended or potentially greater uncertainty about what their resolution or what the journey would end up being. This would presumably ultimately be higher risk, but also potentially higher reward, as Andrew seems to suggest. His point on how we select excellence was also echoed by researcher Jess Wade when I asked her the same question about how she would change the system.
I think that at the moment there's a huge amount locked up in kind of institutional prestige and who you know and who trained you and who's going to give you a tap on the shoulder when you get to the interview, or who's going to look at your background and where you did your PhD and think, oh yeah, I know him. Like that old boys club, that kind of weird academic nepotism impacts every single stage of scientific funding and promotion and job opportunities. And I think that a lot of decision making in science is very, very non-transparent. And they've tried various ways to make it more transparent. Like, they publish who's on the judging panel now. They're a little bit more clear about what the criteria are when you apply for something. They've tried kind of radical things. So in Germany, and I think they tried it with some telescope time, they used to require that you submit your CV, so your resume, and also your scientific proposal. And they found that people were extraordinarily biased against women if they looked at their resume first, because they'd see all these kind of career gaps due to caring responsibilities, and then they'd judge their science worse. Whereas if you did it the other way around, women actually came out better. And so you can do those horrible tricks that just show you how biased we are as a society. But actually, in some areas of science, that's harder to do because we do such specific things that even if you got rid of my resume, you know who I was from reading the proposal. So what I think we need to do is to really train people better on what we're kind of understanding or thinking about what we want this funding to do. So do we want it to give people who are already privileged more opportunity to extend their privilege? Do we need these mega super massive teams of 50 scientists where you continually give them multi-million-pound grants to keep building things? Or do we take these really disruptive kind of high risk ideas from people in institutions who haven't got this huge track record of bringing in multi-million pounds? And do we say we're just going to give you a go? And then how do we evaluate the impact of the science we're doing? So I think there's a huge challenge at the moment in how we gauge or determine what excellence is. And every time you talk to people about like what excellent science is, they say like, oh yeah, we know what it is when we see it, but no one can actually define what that is. And I think that's what all these funding things are looking for. They're looking for that next really high impact, really critical, excellent idea, but no one knows what excellence is. So I think people need to be given really clear guidance of what it is you're applying for, what the point of it is, but also how to do that evaluation and how to check yourself for biases that you might have. Are you biased against people because of their name or because of their ethnicity or because of the institution that they trained in? Are you not giving that person that opportunity because they don't have a track record of managing a multi-million-pound grant before? Because actually not many people manage them well. And so could you go and trust the fact that they're in an institution that will support that team? I think really, really clear training and a much more fair distribution of where things are awarded would be much better for science. And probably, gosh, I have so many ideas. I shouldn't have said that one first, but probably another one would be really funding teams of people, not funding individuals so much. I said these fellowships are nice to have, and of course they're nice to have if you have one, but they're terrible if you don't have one. And actually science is intrinsically done by teams of people, as I, passionately say, we and not I. So I think if we got away from this funding and this kind of putting all of this pressure and this prestige on one person and recognize that actually, this team of people need to be supported to do this activity. And I think some places, like some professional bodies, like the Royal Society of Chemistry, have done this with their awards now. So their awards go to teams of people, not to individuals. And I think that's just key. It's just saying, a team made this breakthrough, not an individual person, and a team will make the next breakthrough. So let's fund that team. And yeah, I guess one more thing, which is incredibly specific and maybe completely boring to everyone listening, is when we apply for scientific funding, more than half of it goes to overheads. So you apply and you get this huge chunk of science funding. You're capped on how much you can pay people, which is obviously a disgrace for PhD students who get massively, massively underpaid. The PhD students of today are not earning too much more. I think they're earning a tiny bit more than you and I earned when we did our PhD at a completely different time. And obviously cost of living in London is atrocious place to try and, exist. So we can apply for all this money. We're capped on how much we can pay for the people that we hire, but we have these huge overheads that we give to universities that you don't really see what happens with it. And it's just like, oh yeah, we know it's really expensive. And I just think, well, I've put all this effort in. But anyway, yeah, so I'd like to be able to pay people what I want and to put all that effort in to apply for something and then to be able to spend that on people rather than, heating the building to 45 degrees during July.
It's interesting, isn't it? This question of individualism in science. We definitely notice this about science from the outside looking in. You know, if you look at famous prizes like the Nobel or all the famous discoveries, they're almost always accompanied by a single name, if not actually named after that individual. I guess that makes for better storytelling, to be honest. And I wonder whether it's maybe a kind of chicken and egg thing as well. We remember the stories of individual scientists because they're more compelling, whereas team protagonists are perhaps less straightforward and easy for us to remember. A move towards collectivist storytelling in science would definitely help to level the playing field, especially for people for whom their individual selves makes them vulnerable to suffering from some form of bias, unconscious or otherwise, from those in power. That's two solutions so far then: accepting proposals with riskier resolutions and promoting grants and calls that come from teams rather than individual protagonists. A third common theme that arose in my conversations was getting comfortable with the uncomfortable feelings of fear, failure, and good old human nature. First, you'll hear Louise Kenny and then Andrew.
It's something that we're really bad at. You know, we don't, as a research community, we prioritise positive results. You know, it's very difficult to publish negative results. People don't want to talk about the hypotheses they had that didn't pan out. But actually, I firmly believe that we should celebrate those. I mean, I've got some, you know, truly epic, unsuccessful research programs in my back catalogue, things that I spent several years, you know, hypotheses that I'd worked on for years, big grants, trials that we raised funding for, we conducted. The trial was just a busted flush. It didn't work. But I'm really, really proud of that work. You know, it was great for the teams. It closed down an avenue of research that others surely would have followed, you know. It's we learned a lot of other stuff doing that work, and it sparked new hypotheses. So there are many things about it to celebrate. But as a research community, we're still not good at doing that. And you just need to look at the number of trials that are registered versus trials that have finally published, which are negative. You know, we need to get better. It was actually the topic of my inaugural lecture when I moved back to Liverpool. It was about celebrating failure. And there's a sort of neat story to it. You want to talk about story, right? So you should someone's ability to tell a story. You can tell a lot about how they can tell a story from their inaugural lecture, because some are very, very factual and science-based. And it's but an inaugural lecture is often delivered to a really random audience of, you know, some of your friends, your colleagues, some experts, but often your grandmother is on the front row, right? So you need to be able to pitch it to everybody. I was born on the evening that Apollo 13 splashed down. And one of the stories that my parents used to tell me when I was a little girl was about the day I was born, and you know, in the delivery room, all the doctors and midwives are listening to the radio to find out whether the spaceman had successfully come back. And it was known as NASA's most successful failure. And I grew up with that birth story, and subsequently have used that in numerous lectures about, you know, how you should celebrate failure, because not all failure is the same. And I still think there's a long way to go for the scientific community to truly embrace that concept. But I do think it's important because science is high risk, and it often doesn't work. But we often learn as much about what doesn't work as we do about what does.
Humans are pattern recognition creatures. We quite often think the thing we're encountering will look like the thing we've encountered in the past. And when we're trying to find creativity and innovation, I think there's quite a lot of cases where people assessing, say, a research proposal go, this is like 75 things I've seen before, and actually just miss that little degree of difference that makes it new and different and means this one will succeed where the others have failed. And so I think that kind of this sort of stuff always goes wrong. Kind of narrative can be an issue in assessment. I think in terms of the large scale deployment of technology, sometimes people get a little scared by the examples of failures, you know, the Concords and this sorts of thing, where you plow a lot into the development of a particular thing. There are always lessons to be learned from that kind of stuff, and very important ones, to say the least. But one can leap too quickly to it's going to go along one of those pathological paths when, again, there are things that good decisions made by technologists and engineers can do to stop that happening, to keep it as something more useful, or just to identify when it's running out of control. So those would be two classic examples. And then I think there's also a thing that, let's be honest, sometimes the future is scary, right? The world does change, and it is changed by technology. I don't know what my great grandparents would have made of the sort of thing we're doing at the moment, sitting in front of a screen, talking to each other with it transmitting by wires. I think that would have seemed really quite unnatural to them. And then I'm sure there are things that will happen in the next generation that will seem similarly unnatural to me. I'm already a little bit scared by the way the kids wander around looking at their phones the whole time and not engaging with each other. Imagine they're doing it with electrodes in their brains that are connected to devices that talk to each other. This is all starting to feel really quite unnerving quite quickly. But it's sort of part of the nature of how humanity changes, is that sometimes we do choose, or maybe choose is the wrong word. We end up going down those new pathways, and it takes us to a very different place. And often this is something we didn't know about when we put the technology together. I remember once hearing a lecture where someone talked about sort of society as a great experiment that's going on in the way in which technology engages with society and has outcomes that we couldn't possibly have anticipated. And one of the most dramatic being just the invention of the sailing ship that could travel across the Atlantic. And this was the sort of thing that, Columbus and co were working on for a long time, and it's how you do the navigation techniques. That ends up just huge consequences for human civilization that we could barely imagine. The transfer of diseases from the old world to the new, and then the transfer of products back, and then the introduction of the slave trade. Now, of course, none of that was inevitable given that technology, but a lot of it was very much facilitated by the fact that technology arose in the society that it did. On the other hand, we wouldn't have anything like the modern world unless we had gone for a stage where something like the intercontinental sailing ship came into existence at some point, enabling trade, enabling connection. And so that sort of thing gives me pause for thought of, in making new technologies, we can be creating new worlds, and those brave new worlds have their excitement and their wonders, but also potentially their horrors. And so how do we try and make sure that as we see the new worlds emerging, we increase the chance of the benefits and minimize the risk of what could be really quite unpleasant possibilities? I mean, if you look across human beings and even great scientists, we have different views about what are good things. And I think not that long ago, we thought that all the great science innovation would be done in something like a Western liberal democracy. And this is now clearly no longer true. A lot of the most important technology innovation is being done in China, which is a relatively authoritarian state, which has a different way of thinking about some of these things from that we would have in the United Kingdom. And that doesn't mean their technology doesn't work. It does, in many cases, it works fantastically well, and is hugely, hugely impressive. I mean, there's just an undeniable, amazing set of progress in engineering and technology that's being achieved. But just sometimes one's a little worried about the technology, some of the values that might be being built into that technology, because there is a society that is leading in the development of things that does just have different values to those that predominate in our society. And I think we're starting to see some contest around that, and this has already had some flashpoints around things like Huawei and connections. But perhaps as AI becomes dominant, we'll see that even further. And even some of the distinctions between what's considered acceptable, in the United States and Western Europe, two societies that traditionally thought pretty close in terms of their adoption of technology. Our views on privacy and the use of data and those sorts of things, actually, we can see them diverging, and some of the tensions there are between the European Commission and some of the big tech firms that are manifestations of this. So it's... whose good is being pursued is one of the questions we need to talk about. And of course, this has particular aspects in a capitalist society where there are often different structures of good. And people benefit. But also when we're looking at, there are these variations of values around the world, but we're all part of a shared research and innovation system in a certain fashion.
I'm really fascinated by how the story of science differs by culture. On the one hand, maybe this shouldn't be surprising. Of course, there are just as many different story forms as there are different cultures around the world. But on the other hand, we have to wonder, with the challenges of science being more and more global in scale, pandemics, antibiotic resistance, climate change, etc., how can we come together to work as a global community to write and tell global scientific stories to global affected communities? These big science stories certainly show us why we, the public, should care about looking after the processes of science. But I want to give Louise the last word on why we, the public, should specifically care about looking after the processes of how science gets funded.
Well, firstly, they pay for it, so, there isn't a magic money tree. Science is funded from government coffers, which ultimately are fueled by taxpayers' money. So if you're paying for it, you should care about it. Because, especially now, right, there are so many calls on the public purse. I think it matters enormously that we as a scientific community explain to the country, to taxpayers, why it matters, what we're doing with it, and why they should continue to invest in science. So that's the first reason why I think the general public, for want of a better word, should care about the science. They are ultimately paying for it. Secondly, lots of countries, because they pay for it, now give the public a say in prioritisation. And we're increasingly doing that in the UK. We run lots of, groups where we do science prioritisation setting exercises, like the James Lind Alliance. Often when we look at clinical research, we ask, have you spoken to patient groups? Have they said that this is a research priority for them? You might think it's really interesting because you're fascinated by that enzyme, but actually the vast majority of people with motor neurone disease are not concerned about that at all. They want to know, so the research prioritization exercise is really important. And thirdly, and possibly, most expansively, why should we care? Science kind of improves life. I'm a medic and I'm clearly biased, and I would say this, but from a medical perspective, there's never been a better time to be alive, right? The best time. I finished treatment for breast cancer a couple of years ago, and when I was going through that experience, I was during lockdown, and I was communicating with my faculty and my team, and I said, I've always believed that there is no better day than today to get cancer, because the pace of scientific discovery, etc. Women are, especially with breast cancer, are living longer now than they ever have done in the history of time. The only better day to get cancer is tomorrow, and the next best day is the day after that. And so, because of the impact that research has had in almost every aspect of our lives, the general public should care. And it's difficult, right? Especially now, there's a lot of bad things happening in the world. No one can deny the impact that climate change is going to have on our future. There are wars. There are massive social inequalities. We are dealing with a lot of bad stuff. But fundamentally, looking back through the history of time, this is still the very best time to be alive. And it's largely better now than it ever has been before because of science, because of research, because of what we've discovered, what we've made, how we've innovated. We've done some bad stuff too. Climate change is a reflection of the Industrial Revolution and the fact that we didn't realize we were going to choke the planet that we live on. But I'm also a glass half full person, and I think that science will get us out of this pickle.
So that brings us to the end of our investigation into the impact of story on how science gets funded. We've heard how storytelling can be an incredibly effective tool for researchers who are seeking to secure scientific funding, but also that its competitive nature forces researchers to play a strategic game as an individual over collaborative, more long-term research. And in this episode, we've looked at how we might fix these problems by encouraging creative, exploratory ideas with less certainty over the outcome, by funding ideas that come from teams and not individuals, and by shifting the culture towards one that is accepting of failure and including stakeholders like the public in consultations to decide what gets funded in the first place. Next episode, we'll be moving our investigation through to the stage of science communication where it has already been funded, been done, and then is going to be published. Which stories might be waiting for us there? Join me next time to find out. This podcast is made in partnership with the UK Reproducibility Network, Sonic Screen Lab at University of the Arts London, and StoryArcs at Bath Spa University. StoryArcs is an Arts and Humanities Research Council funded programme. All of the opinions shared in this podcast are those of the individuals and don't necessarily represent those of their employers. I've been your host, Anna Podajski, and if you want to read more about me and my work around science and story, head over to the Storyology website at storyology.co.uk. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.